I'm Dick Miller. I teach in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm director of the program in Ethics and Public Life. This is the second lecture in a series put on by the program in Ethics and Public Life called After the American Century, Fears and Hopes for America's Future. Seems to me that for any decent person, the fear of war, the hope for peace, those are just about the most profound fears and hopes that there are. At the same time, many people in the United States fear the decline of American global power, which they take to depend on American military might. So the assessment of fears and hopes for America's wars is going to require deep knowledge, explanatory insight, and moral reflectiveness derived from the past and looking to the future. That's why I'm so very glad that our second speaker in the series will be Marilyn Young from the Department of History at NYU. Before this talk, I looked again at the preface to Marilyn Young's powerful book, The Vietnam Wars, which she finished in 1990. And she reflected in her preface in something that forced her to look from the past to the future, as she will in 2013, a few minutes from now. As I was finishing this history of the Vietnam-American War, she wrote, the Cold War was astonishingly ending. There's no way to know what this will mean for the next era of world history. But events in the summer of 1990 suggest that peace with the Soviet Union has not necessarily lessened the American propensity to wage war elsewhere. The Iraq crisis is the post-Cold War era's first approach to war. We have been at war since the end of World War II. One way the Vietnam War might at last end and the post-Cold War peace begin would be for an American president to acknowledge, as a Soviet foreign minister did with respect to Afghanistan, that the United States invaded Vietnam against our stated values and ideals, and that it did so secretly and deceptively, fighting a war of immense violence in order to impose its will on another sovereign nation. Otherwise, only the name of the country changes, and Americans will continue to ask, why are we in Vietnam? Marilyn Young's continue to ask these questions with the name changing from time to time, and she'll offer us the current stage of that inquiry in her talk, Necessary Wars of Choice, the past, present, and future of American war. To introduce Marilyn Young, tell you more about it, about her, Fred Logable of the History Department will have some more to say about her powerful and influential work.
Well, good afternoon. Delighted to see all of you here. Most of you I see on the left side of the room, for whatever that means. I'm very pleased to be here with you and to have a chance to just say a few words about Marilyn Young, who is professor of history and also collegiate professor at NYU. And for me, I think it means something personal for me to be standing here before you and saying a few words, and I'll say just a few things about that in a moment. But to just give you a little bit of Marilyn Young's background, she has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the ACLS. She was a senior Fulbright professor in Bologna, Italy, and has received 2 teaching awards from NYU. She is the author of many books, and I'm going to mention here just 2, the Vietnam Wars. Dick has talked about that. Really masterful book. Also, The Rhetoric of Empire and Transforming Russia and China. And she's the co-editor of, I think, probably close to a dozen books, and has been also involved in producing anthologies, countless articles, and 2 edited volumes worth mentioning here. One is Bombing Civilians, a 20th Century History, and Making Sense of the Vietnam Wars. She has served as president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and has also been on the Council of the American Historical Association. She worked under Ernest May and John Fairbank at Harvard, where she got her PhD. She teaches a range of courses at NYU on the Cold War, on the Vietnam War, or Vietnam Wars, I should say, on U.S. East Asia relations, U.S. wars in Asia, women and social change, and U.S. foreign policy from the 19th century to the present. I want to say just a word about the book that Dick already mentioned, which is the Vietnam War, the Vietnam Wars. I don't think I've said this to Marilyn, actually, but that book, which appeared, I believe, in 1990 or 91, came out just as I was beginning my own doctoral work. And what the book did, it had a very important effect on my own work. Not so much in terms of the particular research that went into the book or a particular chapter in the book. Marilyn's book covers really the whole period of the whole struggle for Indochina from 1945 to the end. And my dissertation was focused really on the period of heavy U.S. escalation in the war in the early and middle 1960s. But what Marilyn's book did was to give me really the courage to push a line of argument that I didn't think really had been adequately pushed, articulated in the scholarship. And like many graduate students, I think I was a little reticent about what I could actually do. This book, and I really urge you to read it if you haven't, really pushes against conventional views on the Indochina struggle on a whole range of issues. It showed me that an argument that I think had taken hold in the scholarship, which suggested that however we might view the Vietnam War now, in the context of its own time in the early and middle 1960s, any president would have done what Kennedy and Johnson did. Any set of policymakers would have taken those actions to Americanize them, with all that that implied. Marilyn's book showed me that I didn't have to make that kind of argument. The evidence was leading me in a different direction anyway. And so I think the book for me was of great importance. I think I would go so far as to say that my book was possible in substantial measure because of the Vietnam Wars, this book that we've been describing. So for that reason, I'm especially grateful to have this opportunity to introduce Marilyn. I want to give you one other quote before I sit down. This is from her Schaefer presidential address. It's also, I can tell you, part of her Wikipedia entry. So if
I have a Wikipedia?
you have a Wikipedia, I can tell you it was not me.
Okay.
But if you miss any part of this, if you miss any part of what I'm about to read and you're interested, go to the Wikipedia entry, or better yet, go to the presidential address. It's printed in a journal called Diplomatic History, which is Schaefer's own journal, and it's a marvelous presidential address. But here's what she writes. I find, and maybe this will resonate with what you're going to tell us today.
I'm sure, it's what I think about all the time.
I find that I have spent most of my life as a teacher and scholar thinking and writing about war. I moved from war to war, from the War of 1898 and U.S. participation in the Boxer Expedition and the Chinese Civil War, to the Vietnam War, back to the Korean War, then further back to World War II, and forward to the wars of the 20th and early 21st century. Initially, I wrote about all of these as if war and peace were discrete. Pre-war, war, peace, or post-war. Over time, this progression of wars has looked to me less like a progression than a continuation. As if between one war and the next, the country was on hold. We're privileged ladies and gentlemen, to have Marilyn Young with us this afternoon as part of the Ethics and Public Life series. She is, without question, one of our leading historians of U.S. foreign relations anywhere. She is a mentor and a friend, and I'm delighted she is here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marilyn Young.
That was great. I think my mics, yes, my mics are about to go on. Is the sound okay? I want to thank Dick Miller for inviting me, and both Dick and Fred for introducing me. If my book made Choosing War, Fred's first great book, possible, that is just terrific. I'm very pleased to learn that. Here's a pathetic thing about the preface that Dick read to you from. When I finished that book, I really thought that the United States just couldn't make war anymore. I mean, I had just shown how terrible, useless, wrong it was. And the next thing I know, there's Desert Storm. And I felt personally insulted, and I have felt personally insulted ever since. I want to begin with 3 quotations. The first gives you a taste of war, a little taste. It's from Benjamin Bush's memoir of his year in Iraq, and it goes, this was 2005. We collected these people in their kitchen and guarded them from us as we used their house to fight back against their neighborhood. My days were not condemned by the things I had expected. It was the pointlessness and the faces of the people who were left to live in the violence we had brought with us or had drawn to us. Our bullets had gone out into other people's lives. We gathered our wreckage and our dead, and someone who lived there filled in the holes in the road made by the bombs left for us. The second is the former head of the CIA, Leon Panetta. He said this very recently. When the president drew a red line, damn it, you've got to do it. And the it means war. And finally, from Jon Stewart, who has been the best commentator on the current situation, in his broadcast on September 4th, he said, and it seems to me to reflect directly on Panetta, even though we're a superpower, we haven't figured out yet that we don't actually have superpowers. We keep jumping out of the building, thinking we're going to fly. The consequences of the wars the United States launched at the start of the 21st century continue to play themselves out. Afghanistan is still a war zone in which American soldiers die even as their numbers dwindle. And there were, in fact, 2 today announced dead American soldiers. Iraq has reverted to the sectarian bloodletting the United States troop surge was supposed to have resolved years ago. And Libya, while free of its longtime single dictator, is now subject to the rule of numerous paramilitaries. According to a recent report by Patrick Coburn, quote, government authority, in Libya this is disintegrating in all parts of the country, putting in doubt claims by American, British, and French politicians that NATO's military action in Libya was an outstanding example of a successful foreign military intervention which should be repeated in Syria, end quote. This summer, we have all watched the slow-motion approach of the Obama administration to just such a repetition. In the background, a basso continuo, there were the ongoing invisible acts of war, an accelerating American use of cyber war, 231 offensive attacks in 2011 alone, and the ongoing drone attacks in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan. Until late August, I would have made a straightforward argument that the United States has, over the decades, slowly and steadily moved itself to the fulfillment of one of the long-term policy objectives of defense intellectuals such as Robert Osgood and Henry Kissinger in the 1950s. The capacity to fight limited wars for limited goals without unduly upsetting the electorate, a state of permanent, if unrecognized, war. So now in Syria, President Obama's suggestion that there was a red line Bashar al-Assad must not cross had hardened into a conviction that the, quote, credibility of the country, and of course his own, was on the line. We've been here before, repeatedly. American credibility has been on the line in every administration since 1945, and in every administration was maintained by a readiness to use military force. Yet Obama's acknowledgement that the country was, quote, weary of war, and his shifting of the burden of decision to Congress before being rescued by Putin, which we'll talk about, indicated the possibility that rather than an ongoing process of militarization, as I had thought, something new might be underway. I stress might. In the event, of course, Putin's timely intervention saved Obama and the Congress from having to act. But it is, and probably I should knock wood here, but it is useful to reflect on Obama's earlier explanation of why the United States must act. His explanation began with a but. Quote, "But we are the United States of America, and we cannot and must not turn a blind eye to what happened in Damascus. Out of the ashes of World War, we built an international order and enforced the rules that gave it meaning. And we did so because we believe that the rights of individuals to live in peace and dignity depends on the responsibility of nations. We aren't perfect, but this nation, more than any other, has been willing to meet those responsibilities," end quote. It is unclear to me the extent to which any substantial portion of the American public still accept this qualified expression of the United States as what Madeleine Albright once called the indispensable nation. Poll data on the possibility of intervention in Syria was unequivocal. The overwhelming majority of Americans were opposed to any form of intervention in Syria, including supplying the opposition with arms. Some 70% polled against such an effort to supply the rebels. However, remaining the indispensable nation is still the goal of the heirs of Cold Warriors like Osgood and Kissinger. Elliot Cohn, Elliot Abrams, Fuad Ajami, Robert Kagan, William Crystal, Max Boot, among others, have signed a strong letter to the president urging, quote, direct military strikes against the pillars of the Assad regime. The goal would be, quote, not only to ensure that Assad's chemical weapons no longer threaten America. Think about that sentence for a minute. Our allies in the region or the Syrian people, but also to deter or destroy the Assad regime's air power and other conventional means of committing atrocities against civilian non-combatants, end quote. In addition, the U.S. should increase its efforts to train and arm the, quote, moderate elements in the armed opposition, with the goal, quote, of empowering them to prevail against both the Assad regime and the growing presence of al-Qaeda affiliates and other extremist rebel factions in the country, end quote. These experts, so they were designated by the Weekly Standard, which published their letter, urged the United States into a three-way civil war against Assad and against the most effective fighters attempting to overthrow him. And they were outraged when they were robbed of war. Quote, "This is not a serious alternative to military action," Max Boot complained. "It is a distraction from the real issue." He means negotiations. "It is a distraction from the real issue, which is not Assad's chemical weapons, but the continuing existence of the Assad regime itself," end quote. As I wrote this and as I speak it now, I don't know what the outcome will be. I think it's still in play. But for the first time since the end of the Vietnam War, I feel the country is at a point of choice, whether to insist on maintaining and exercising its one claim to superiority, military power, or find some other approach to international relations, one that involves negotiation, international cooperation, a way out of war. Perhaps the allergy to war that followed the end of the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam, perhaps that allergy has recurred, an Iraq syndrome, which might, like the Vietnam syndrome earlier, once again make the use of force abroad more difficult than presidents and policymakers would like. I'll return to this question in my conclusion. But my talk this afternoon is about how we got here, and I think, well, maybe just because I'm a historian, I think how we got here matters. I think the past matters. How the present state was characterized about a decade ago by Lawrence DeRitta, Special Assistant to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Quote, "We've always thought of post-hostilities as a phase distinct from combat. The future of war," he went on, is that these things are going to be more of a continuum. This is the future for the world we're in at the moment. We'll get better at it as we do it more often. And he was right about everything except the last phrase. My title, Necessary Wars of Choice, is drawn from an essay by a commentator with whom I am usually at odds, Robert Kagan. Shortly after Obama declared that he would withdraw the United States from Bush's chosen war in Iraq, but continue to fight the war of necessity in Afghanistan, Kagan observed, quote, "The claim of necessity wipes out the moral ambiguities inherent in the exercise of power," end quote. The same claim of necessity answers the question, why are we in whatever particular country or countries the United States happens to be in at the moment? The claim of necessity is rarely questioned. This has been possible for several reasons, among them the immunity of Americans from war at home. Americans' inability to imagine being bombed rather than bombing has enabled the repeated use of force by their government. And I should note that all of America's limited wars involved massive amounts of bombing. More significant, perhaps, as a shield against the reality of bombing, was the way the Cold War functioned so that wars of choice could be fought and military force could serve as an ordinary instrument of policy. Let me explain. I hope I haven't offended. In the United States, the economic, social, and cultural mobilization for the Cold War required that Americans be weaned from the common sense view, which Fred mentioned, that wartime and peacetime were distinct periods of time. A country fought a war. That's how it used to be. In the case of the United States, won it, and then there was peace. Wartime required conscription, the death and maiming of American servicemen, civilian economic sacrifices, and patriotic movies. Peacetime meant, in a phrase that only some of you will recall, the lights going on all over again, all over the world, marriages, babies, cars, washing machines, and patriotic movies about the good war. Peace was normative, and war an unhappy, though sometimes necessary, aberration. However, the Cold War was a liminal condition, neither peace nor war, an indefinite pre-war. For this to be accepted as an ongoing state of affairs, Americans had to correct what the leading theorist of limited war, Robert Osgood, called their, quote, faulty habit of mind that regards war as a thing in itself rather than a continuation of political intercourse. End quote. Instead, Americans thought of war, and Osgood really hated this, either as a crusade or as something to abolish. Osgood wanted the country to understand the use of force in Clausewitzian terms, an instrument for obtaining concrete, limited political objectives. The United States must be held in a state of permanent readiness. Occasional hot wars would be limited in terms of weapons, duration, and objective, since the alternative might unleash an annihilating nuclear war. And the public was asked to attend to this state of things along a very narrow band of concern. Too great public attention might lead to demands for a quick and final victory in any given conflict. Too little, a reluctance to pay the mounting cost of eternal vigilance. The balance was difficult to maintain, often politically unworkable. A military composed of citizen soldiers was bound to think of war as a thing in itself and demand a quick, successful conclusion. The history of the Cold War in the United States is thus the history of how, while never abandoning World War II as the Platonic idea of war, post-war administrations strove to use military force in a limited, instrumental way. To this end, they had to create a public tolerance for the use of military force abroad as normal rather than aberrational. So normal that after a while, only those who were actively engaged in fighting it and their families noticed it was being fought at all. One problem for those like Osgood or Kissinger who wanted to accustom Americans to the use of force as a standard instrument of policy was the absence of an accepted tradition of colonial wars. Since the United States was not, in the eyes of its citizens, an empire, its long history of colonial warfare had been effectively excised from collective memory. To be sure, the United States had expanded, first across the continent, then across the Pacific to Hawaii and the Philippines, but that was a one-off. The numerous military interventions in Central America rarely made it into the standard texts from which most Americans learned their own history, nor did the movements which resisted the growth of empire. And in this, the United States differed from European countries whose imperial wars and the opposition to them were acknowledged and integral to their national histories. In the United States, public support required that all new wars be justified, as World War II had been, by the invocation, for example, of the enduring memory of Munich and the dangers of appeasement, of the insatiable appetite of totalitarian regimes, of the importance of repelling aggression. And you know, I mean, Kerry has said a lot of things recently, but the most outrageous really was his invocation of Munich in the current Syrian crisis. This is just such a deliberate grab for something that will justify war. Having found a good war, politicians invoked it at every occasion, despite the multiplying contradictions of sustaining the country in a state that was neither all-out war nor genuine peace. The Korean War was the first test of the American public's capacity to embrace limited wars, and the public came close to failing. While most people had supported Truman's initial intervention as casualties mounted and peace talks at Panmunjom seemed permanently stalled, a majority of the public told posters it believed the war had been a mistake. Throughout the war, the Truman administration had labored against the reluctance of the country to go to war in the first place, or once in, to limit its scope. And that's when you get that classic American sentence, which you had in Vietnam as well, and probably come up again, in or out. And it always sounds very aggressive, in or out. But I think you have to pay attention to the or out and credit that might really have meaning. In, meaning go all the way, eliminate them, or out, just get out. So Truman had trouble throughout with the reluctance of the country to either limit its scope or to stay in. But throughout the war, it could count on a kind of tacit public acceptance of its policies, a sullen acquiescence, until they were repudiated in the general election of 1952 with the decisive defeat of the Democratic Party. There were no massive demonstrations, as there would be against the Vietnam War, no military mutinies, no one burned his draft card, and in the aftermath, no investigation of how the war had been fought, but only of the behavior of American prisoners of war. Succeeding administrations remembered the political price paid by the Democratic Party, and they worked to avoid it. But Korea seemed to hold few general lessons for the future. Perhaps for that reason, the country slipped easily into another limited war in Asia, one which none of the presidents who fought it were ever able to sell for very long, but which together they prolonged for 15 years. The particular lesson the government had learned in Korea was not to provoke China's entry into the war, and this lesson it applied successfully in Vietnam. Initially, the Vietnam War resembled the early days of the Korean War. There was nothing as dramatic as the North Korean attack across the 38th parallel, but the Kennedy administration was able to make a rather belabored case to an inattentive public that the fighting in Vietnam was the result of North Vietnamese aggression against a struggling new nation, which gave the United States involvement a patina of modest necessity. Still, as Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara observed, quote, "The greatest contribution Vietnam is making, right or wrong, is beside the point." This is a classic McNamara. The greatest contribution Vietnam is making, right or wrong, is beside the point, is that it is developing in the United States an ability to fight a limited war, to go to war without the necessity of arousing the public ire, end quote. McNamara fully expected this would be the shape of future wars. The early counterinsurgency period under Kennedy, as intended, barely registered on the public. Actually, I'm researching this now, and I mustn't really digress because there isn't that much time. But in 1963, what finally got the public's attention was a letter to the editor by Bertrand Russell. I mean, it got peace groups' attention. And Russell wrote a letter to the Times in which he said, you know, I don't know how many of you Americans are aware, but you are fighting a war of annihilation in Vietnam and using methods that are atrocities. The New York Times was very offended and called Russell essentially a communist dupe. really not mincing words, and the exchanges between the Times and Russell went on for a long time, but not in public. Meanwhile, it began to attack the attention of peace people who had been reluctant to mix Vietnam with their general effort for disarmament. But from that point on, which was about March, April 63, they did. Okay. I have to stop. I have to go back to this. I'm very interested in this new piece of research, a very small paper I'm doing. Anyhow, the counterinsurgency period didn't register very much, but by the end of 63, the failure of counterinsurgency raised the question of increasing troop levels and an ever-increasing draft calls. This time, a public schooled in protest by the civil rights movement was less inclined to accept government policy. As explanations of the war shifted to repel North Vietnamese aggression, to contain China, to maintain U.S. credibility, as the tactics used to fight it came full circle, counterinsurgency, war of attrition, counterinsurgency with saturation bombing, and the number of American casualties mounted, the opposition grew. Acceptance of the war vanished. The draft was abandoned, and in due course, so was the war. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the American attitude toward war seemed to change. Congress passed the War Powers Act in an attempt to constrain the war-making propensity and power of the executive. Briefly, it seemed that no administration could or would commit the country to war except for reasons of self-defense. And even then, only after a congressional declaration of war. The general repudiation of the use of armed force abroad was so fierce it was given a name, the Vietnam Syndrome. It was as if the country had become allergic to war in all its forms. The effort to overcome the anti-war legacy of Vietnam and transform it into its opposite, a tolerance for war so long as it could be conducted quietly, without fuss or conscription, has occupied every administration since the defeat of Jimmy Carter. One approach to the cure of the allergy to war featured small homeopathic doses of war, notable for their outsized names and the near total absence of American casualties. I don't know how many of you remember Operation Urgent Fury. The name is very evocative. Urgent Fury was the rescue of students who couldn't get into American medical schools from unknown dangers in Grenada. And then there was Operation Just Cause. You remember Just Cause? Some of you do. Just Cause was a successful assault on the drug lord Manuel Noriega in Panama. No one commented on the semantic oddity of launching specific military operations in the absence of an ongoing war. Because usually, you have Operation Rolling Thunder, but that's inside a war. These were operations outside of any particular war. Meanwhile, the military, recovering from the demoralization of the Vietnam War, set about building an all-volunteer professional army and devising a new doctrine for its use. The Weinberger-Powell doctrine was like an insurance policy against all that had complicated the Vietnam War. There would have to be strong public support before any war began. Force would be used massively rather than incrementally, goals would be limited, the exit clearly marked, and a declaration of victory thus assured. And in 1990, just when I was writing that preface, George H.W. Bush field tested the doctrine. One might think that with the Cold War over, ending in what most Americans understood as an American victory, it was time to enjoy the peace dividend, the profit owed Americans from their investment in hot and cold wars of the preceding decades. Surely the president would be hard-pressed to find a suitable enemy. But as one war hawk told a fellow conservative, Saddam Hussein came along and saved the country from the peace dividend. Once again, the casus belli was aggression. Gulf War I was described by the president and the mainstream media as a mini World War II. Saddam Hussein was Hitler. Kuwait stood for occupied Europe. Appeasement was unacceptable. In accordance with the Weinberger-Powell doctrine, months were spent gathering public support. This was the Desert Shield part of the operation. Press control was strict, and in this and every other particular, and they really thought it through, this was not Vietnam. Once more, albeit on a smaller stage, the United States had beaten another Hitler, liberated a country. This was war as it was meant to be, And at its conclusion, President Bush declared that the country had, quote, kicked the Vietnam syndrome. John Hay dubbed the War of 1898 a splendid little war, and just a little short of its centennial celebration, George H.W. Bush seemed to echo Hay. His splendid little war was an antidote to Vietnam, a ringing message of American intent to diversify and dominate in the Middle East, a flexing of military muscle. American casualties were light, 148 dead in combat as compared to 100,000 Iraqi combat deaths, and no one counted the Iraqi civilians. In this radical disparity of dead and wounded, Desert Storm recapitulated all of America's small wars from the 19th to the 21st centuries. It was a mix of limited war and total war, satisfying the public desire for decisive victory with the administration's more modest goals, and fulfilling, in part, Robert Osgood's hope that the United States finally would learn to use force for, quote, concrete, limited political objectives, end quote. Bush had demonstrated that the United States could emerge victorious in a chosen limited war. His son was far more ambitious. The new policy was set in the 2002 National Security Strategy, whose language and attitudes sound archaic today, and I'll just remind you of them a little bit. I mean, they've been really outstripped by events. The 2002 Security Strategy opened with the assertion that the 20th century ended in a decisive victory for the forces of freedom and a single, sustainable model for national success: freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. That's a quote. Those all three go together. America would use its economic power abroad to encourage pro-growth legal and regulatory policies, lower marginal tax rates, sound business policies, and free trade. And free trade was defined as a moral principle. The National Security Strategy was a blend of neoconservative American domestic order, American prescriptions for the world, and American military supremacy. American military force must be strong enough, quote, to dissuade potential adversaries from pursuing a military buildup in hopes of surpassing or equaling the power of the United States. September 11th enabled the Bush administration to pursue, with less opposition and greater violence, the policy implication of the national strategy's vision. Bush would use America's immense military might to establish effective U.S. global domination in the name of liberal capitalism, Western values, civilization itself, under the mantle of a large and necessary war, the global war against terror. Bush could launch small wars against Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as threaten Iran and North Korea. Yet despite Grenada, Panama, Gulf War I, and 9/11, Bush's administration was as haunted by the limited war gone bad, Vietnam, as its predecessors. As early as October 21st, 2001, R.W. Apple, an old Vietnam hand, considered the war in Afghanistan under the headline, quote, "A military quagmire remembered, Afghanistan as Vietnam," end quote. The war in Afghanistan began with massive bombing raids. I don't know how many of you remember that, but they were. Followed by the dispatch of a relatively small number of combat troops, which 7 years later had to be increased. Yet because the increase never involved general conscription, dramatic tax increases, or significant economic sacrifice by the public at large, after the failure of the massive protests in February 2003, the public remained, as it had been during the Korean War, perhaps unhappy, disenchanted, but quiescent, which is all the government needs. The Bush administration deflected questions about the launching of the war in Iraq to predictions about what would happen after the United States withdrew. Sort of the classic statement of this position was made by David Kilcullen, General Petraeus' close advisor, who said, quote, "I was very critical of the war in Iraq in 2002, saying we shouldn't be doing this. Once they decided to go ahead and do it, I felt it as my duty, as a military guy, to help do it in the best possible way, minimize the damage, as it were." The new hope for America's limited war in Iraq lay in its redefinition as counterinsurgency warfare. Article after article wondered why the counterinsurgency lessons of Vietnam had been forgotten. In some renderings, the claim was that counterinsurgency had actually won the war in Vietnam before losing it again through the irresponsibility of the press or of Congress or the anti-war movement or all three. In other accounts, the claim was only that counterinsurgency would have won in Vietnam had it been practiced early enough, hard enough, long enough. Familiar names from old colonial wars reappeared in new revised editions, and a new field manual on counterinsurgency was drawn up. The manual was hailed as a great step forward, and when Petraeus seemed to have succeeded in Iraq, in putting its principles into practice in Iraq, fears of another Vietnam vanished. And if you look at the press, this Vietnam syndrome, is this another Vietnam? Is it another quagmire? They really go away with Petraeus' troop surge and the apparent success there. With counterinsurgency back in the curriculum and at the center of U.S. tactical thinking in the Middle East, there was a brief sense of optimism about the future of American military ventures. The war in Iraq had been a success, although Iraq itself was in a wretched state, as devastated today as it was in the immediate aftermath of the 2003 invasion. And this is a subject for a longer conversation, but I think it's important to note that no one refers to Iraq as a victory. That's not the word that's been used at all. In the current idiom of war, the opposite of defeat is success, where success means only the possibility of withdrawing American troops. Surely, the argument went on, the lessons of Iraq could be applied in Afghanistan. The focus of the discussion in Obama's first year in the presidency was on tactics, counterterrorism or counterinsurgency. Should the U.S. reduce its forces, concentrate on using drones and special forces to hound al-Qaeda anywhere in the world? Or should it increase its forces so as to counter not al-Qaeda in Pakistan or Yemen or Afghanistan, but the Taliban in Afghanistan, working to establish the institutions necessary to transform Afghanistan from a fragmented narco-state into a modern and stable nation? Both approaches look to the Afghanization of the war, which has meant a radical increase in the size and power of the Afghan army and police, trained, equipped, and paid for by the United States. Just as an aside, the results have been mixed both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. An article in the Times on September 3rd reported that the security forces the United States had trained at immense expense were not only ineffective, but were themselves, quote, a growing source of abuse, end quote. And there are signs that the same thing is happening in Afghanistan. Until a year ago, the Afghan story was about the success of counterinsurgency. But buried in the stories of how well counterinsurgency was working were regular reports of the way it was not working. Reporters following in the wake of U.S. patrols reported the response of the local population. Quote, "There was peace here before you came," an AP reporter records a farmer telling a Marine patrol. "Today, there is only fighting." Faith in counterinsurgency has faded. Although population-centric efforts continue, the main thrust has been a radical increase in the use of night raids by special forces units, which were intended to root out mid-level Taliban insurgents, and then drone strikes targeted to assassinate the leadership of al-Qaeda and or the Taliban. Let me talk about each of these just for a little bit and relate them to what I see as the intended shape of American imperial policing in the future. First, the special forces. The number of hunter-killer teams operating in Afghanistan has increased exponentially, along with drone attacks. Worldwide, special operations forces operate in 75 countries, a deployment the Obama administration justifies on the basis of the 2001 congressional mandate that authorized the war in Afghanistan right after 9/11. That's the authorization of the use of military force that we still operate under. The Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, as if you like to use acronyms, is a secret army, which has been described by William Arkin and Dana Priest in their book, Top Secret America. This army has increased to 25,000 people since it was founded in 1980, and it operates in maximum secrecy with its own drones, its own intelligence gathering units, satellites, cyber war specialists, and kill teams. "We are the dark matter," one Navy SEAL told Arkin and Priest. The SEALs operate under JSOC. "We're the dark matter. We're the force that orders the universe but can't be seen," end quote. And if you've seen Zero Dark 30, which fully captures this ideology, you'll see what he means by the dark matter. The other new element are drones, currently launched from 60 secret bases on 2 continents and operated by both the CIA and the military. Although the new director of the CIA has expressed a desire to return the CIA to its original focus on intelligence and analysis, one wonders if he'll be able to reverse the tide of the militarization of the CIA. Today, the CIA has become, in the words of one of its operatives, quote, one hell of a killing machine, end quote. Who it kills is not subject to public review. For the US, drones are the ultimate weapon. No Americans are ever at risk, except now and then by accident, as is also the case with Afghan and Pakistan civilians. The Bush administration used drones in Pakistan on 44 occasions over 5 years, killing an announced 400 people. Under Obama, there have been over 300 strikes, and the body count is 4 times Bush's record. More powerful and sophisticated drones are on their way. For example, these numbers are hard to absorb, but they're so stupendous, I'm going to read them anyhow. The Falcon hypersonic cruise vehicle that can fly 13,000 miles in an hour, 20 miles high in the sky, drop 12,000 pounds of explosives 9,000 miles from the United States in less than 2 hours, destroying a target, quote, anywhere in the world on 30 minutes' notice with no need of a nearby airbase, end quote. To this should be added the extraordinary surveillance regimen that has grown up since 9/11. Even before Snowden's revelations exposed the extent of NSA spying on all and sundry, Arkin and Priest counted 3,000 private and public intelligence agencies in 33 secret building complexes in the Washington, D.C. area, all of which generated 50,000 intelligence reports each year, though it's unclear how many of them ever get read. The black budget, so-called, for U.S. intelligence agencies came to $52.6 billion in 2013, with over 100,000 employees. In early January, a news report described Obama, quote, surrounded by a tableau of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in dress uniforms with chests full of medals, as he announced his new military strategy. Given the country's economic woes, there'd be a downsizing of the Army and the Marine Corps, although the actual defense budget would increase. Anticipating Republican charges that he was endangering U.S. security, the president declared, quote, I firmly believe, and I think the American people understand, that we can keep our military strong and our nation secure with a defense budget that continues to be larger than the next 10 countries combined. Our military will be leaner, this is still a quote, but the world must know the United States is going to maintain military superiority, end quote. However, in the future, the United States would not undertake costly counterinsurgency efforts, but instead focus on, quote, tailored capabilities appropriate for counterterrorism and irregular warfare, end quote. Should anyone think tailoring meant a reduction in America's, they're not going to make the pants shorter, in America's global military effort, the strategy paper declared that, quote, for the foreseeable future, the United States will continue to take an active approach to countering these threats by monitoring the activities of non-state threats worldwide, working with allies and partners to establish control over ungoverned territories, and directly striking the most dangerous groups and individuals when necessary. That's an extraordinary claim, if you think about it. Ungoverned territories? What's that? Dangerous groups and individuals when necessary? Most reporters focused on the reduction in force levels, but Walter Pincus, the Washington Post military analyst, pointed out that Obama had extended and deepened George W. Bush's commitment to preemptive war. What does it mean, he asked, that the United States will strike the most dangerous groups and individuals when necessary? Who decides who they are and by what criteria? All of this, Pincus concluded, has a policeman of the world quality. At the start of his presidency, Obama declared Afghanistan a necessary war. I have noted Robert Kagan's observation about the claim of necessity wiping away the moral ambiguities in the exercise of power. The ability of American presidents to exercise power in this manner rests in part on the increasing separation of most of the country from the wars its military fights. The United States now has a permanent professional army, supplemented by contract military personnel, whose numbers are never very clear, to me anyhow, armed with weapons that reduce casualties to a minimum, available for such political/military tasks as any given administration might decide to pursue. The general public, safe from the experience of war, can, and by and large does, ignore its existence. Stephanie Gaskell, who has covered defense policy closely for a number of newspapers, observed, quote, "The preferred standing operating procedure now is to keep world order through limited engagements using naval and air assets, cyber and drone technology, small elite counter-terror units, anything but U.S. boots on the ground, to maintain U.S. security interests across the globe," which, she pointed out, was how it all began in Afghanistan after 9/11. But I'm less certain than I have been in the past that keeping American boots in the closet will enable another military intervention. For the past 2 years, the president refused to be pressured into a full-scale intervention in Syria. He had hoped either to avoid military action altogether or, unwilling to seem impotent in the face of the ongoing disaster in Syria, he challenged Assad to cross an arbitrary line of atrocity, confident he could devise, quote, "a tailored response with international support." Instead, the world, including the American public, seems to have learned several things from the war in Iraq. First, to distrust the uses to which intelligence is put. Second, to fear and expect escalation. And finally, to conclude that the wars the United States has fought in the 21st century thus far have all been futile. Without either conscription or an ongoing anti-war mobilization, without even close media coverage of these wars, the country has nevertheless become, in Obama's words, weary of war. To be sure, the administration resisted using the word war in connection with any action it might take in Syria. "We are not asking America to go to war," Secretary of State John Kerry explained to Congress. His evidence, quote, "I don't believe we're going to war. I just don't believe that. That's just not what we're doing there," end quote. "It's a limited and focused operation," General Martin Dempsey, head of the JCS, explained. I spoke at the start. Just as just an aside, Truman had the same problem in Korea. In one of the first press conferences after the Korean War started, reporters said, "So what do you? Is this a war?" And there was silence from Truman. And finally, a reporter says, "It's a police action, right?" Truman says, "Yes, that's what it is." And then there's a great Korean War movie in which one soldier says to the other, "If this is a police action, where are the cops?" I spoke at the start of an Iraq syndrome. In the case of Vietnam, getting around the syndrome entailed countering that syndrome, a determined effort by policymakers and defense intellectuals to find a cure. It was a direct effort to find a cure so the force could be used again at the discretion of the executive and with minimal interference from the public. This was achieved, as I indicated, through a variety of means, not least the work of pundits who reinterpreted the Vietnam War as wrongly fought rather than wrong in and of itself. A tactical, not a strategic error. It is likely that a similar effort will be made with the Iraq syndrome. If, as a new intervention is broached, someone points to the failure of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to achieve peace in those countries, the likely response will be, well, the United States pulled out too soon. Already, one Brookings Institute analyst, William Galston, has written an alarm about just such an Iraq syndrome. Quote, "The question is whether this new sentiment," he wrote in an early Wall Street Journal, I was about to say Washington Square News, that's my campus newspaper, Wall Street Journal column. "The question is whether this new sentiment will dominate policy, whether acting for the wrong reasons in Iraq will prevent acting for the right reasons in Syria. The United States," Galston argued, "is the guarantor of the global order, which we took the lead in creating and from which the United States benefits. Quote, the task of U.S. leaders is to remind the people that we have a lot to lose if others come to believe we're no longer willing to bear the burdens of leadership," end quote. Galston doesn't specify what those losses might be. For him, the ability of the United States to act with force on such problems as it deems necessary must be preserved. A reluctant public is a drag on that ability, though not absolutely incapacitating. More problematic has been Putin's last-minute intervention and his apparent bid for equal status with the United States. Even more galling was his calling out of American exceptionalism. Quote, "It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation," he wrote, or Lavrov wrote in his name. "There are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions and those still finding their way to democracy. Their policies differ too," end quote. And then, recalling Obama's own peroration in which he called on God to bless the United States of America, Putin concluded, quote, "We are all different, but when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us equal," end quote. The man has a terrific sense of humor. Everything about Syria is still in play, and I do not know what the outcome of the current situation will be. In the interim, between Obama's calling on Congress to vote on the issue and Putin's intervention, there was the beginning of a real debate in town hall meetings, in letters to the editor, in national and local newspapers, and in a sudden surge of anti-war petitions, demonstrations, and appeals. Opposition is apparently strong within the military as well as the general public. Before the current wave of opposition to intervention, I would have concluded this talk by quoting General Petraeus' remarks to Bob Woodward about the war in Afghanistan. Quote, "I don't think you win this war. I think you keep fighting. This is the kind of war we're in for the rest of our lives and probably our kids' lives," end quote. And that remark prompted Andrew Basevich to ask whether we have all now become prisoners of war. And that's where I would have ended, full stop. Prisoners of war, all of us. But the aftermath of Obama's brief move towards a new war in Syria, in that aftermath, there's the glimmer of the possibility of a prison break. And that's where I'll conclude now. Who knows what will happen tomorrow, but that's where we are now, I think. Thank you. Is there time for questions?
Would you like to call on people, or should I?
Yeah, no, I'll call on people. I don't know how much time we have, that's the question.
Until 6 o'clock.
Oh,
So
fine.
now we have time for discussion. I'd just like to make one...
But people should feel free to leave. They're not, there's always that moment of imprisonment when a talk ends. Anybody who needs to go should not feel bad. You have to leave. I will take it personally, but it's all right. I won't leave again.
If you have a question or a comment, please stand up and speak loudly. The reason is it's actually rather hard for people in the audience to hear other people in the audience, in this auditorium. Okay.
Questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah, I have one. I do have to leave. I appreciated your talk. My question is, since the U.S. controls about 70% of the world's arms trade, and the pressure from those arms dealers are to keep war going, the prison break seems to me to be less possible.
Well, of course, prison breaks occur even when the entire community is earning big bucks off having the prison in their community, right? But let's drop the metaphor. The only way to deal with that kind of thing is with public pressure. I mean, there's no other way. You have to have public pressure brought to bear to say, we don't need this, there are other things that can be done. In 1945, there was this terror of peace conversion, to be sure averted by the creation of the national security state. My point is we don't have to go back there. There are things to be done with money that now goes to defense contractors. Suppose you cut the defense budget, as David Stockman suggested, in half. Just cut it in half, from $600 billion to $300 billion, and then use that money productively. Why not? Or just gave everybody a tax break, whatever. The point is, this inflated defense budget, and it's defense in quotes, it's a war budget. It doesn't seem to me impossible, through organization, to begin to think how to overcome it. It's what peace groups have been about all along. I mean, granted, not with great success, but you just keep working. What else?
You're more hopeful about that than I am.
Well, only today. Tomorrow,
Power is awfully strong in public pressure. Recently, given the constraints of the two-party system, in particular, seems to be very weak.
well, you could be right. I mean, for most of the time, you have been right. What do I think? I hope. I have this hope. I think the fact that we didn't go to war, that Obama was stopped by a combination of the democratic system in the UK working, to everyone's astonishment. You brought it before the representatives of the people, and they said, no, you may not go to war. I think that was stunning. And that Obama then felt he had to bring it to Congress, and then there was this explosion. I mean, John McCain goes home, and people are yelling at him. The Georgia Peach Parade, or whatever there is, people on the sidelines have big signs, no war in Syria. Now, it seems to me at least conceivable that some of that can be translated into a longer term of not just avoidance of war, but doing something else with the economy. They keep saying it on the radio, and it's astonishing to me that there isn't somehow more of a response. 45 million Americans living in poverty, poverty defined as $23,500 for a family of 4. I mean, what kind of country is this? It should be possible to say that. There was a brief moment when Howard Dean was sort of saying that stuff before the rest of the Democratic Party jumped on him and just robbed him blind. I mean, that was the end of that. But there was that moment, and Dean was talking about that kind of thing. Lately, I haven't been in agreement with him. That's okay. When he was running in the primaries, he was articulating this, and there was a real response. I think it's possible to get a response from many different perspectives, including up to limits, the libertarians, who are against all of this as well. Why not? You're just a pessimist. No, you're a realist. I understand.
Yeah, I would point out one thing. Occupy Wall Street was very hopeful, and it seems to have dissipated. And that was a movement that really, at a crucial movement in the economy's crisis, came to being, and where is it now? So, I mean, an organized left, I don't see. And that
certainly I don't either. I don't see an organized left. I don't see it here. I don't see it in most countries. Actually, the really surprise to me is its disappearance in many European countries of a really strong organized left. But the thing, Occupy is really interesting to look at closely and to analyze. And they made a choice about being unprogrammatic. The response to Occupy, the fact that so many people came out and everyone was saying, oh, wow, this is great, but then they had nothing to offer. And the dissipation was therefore, I think, in the cards. On the other hand, some piece of Occupy continued, and they've had this project of buying up medical debt and forgiving it. So poor people who are in deep medical debt can appeal to this fund and have their medical debt forgiven. I don't know what the status of that is now. I know it was a campaign for a while, and it seemed to have collected a rather substantial amount of money. This is small, but it's in what has been kind of a desert. It's something. So Occupy divides into separate interest groups, which may or may not be able to do more. But the initial response, I think, has to be remembered. The way it was gladly greeted. And then, their particular take on how you operate was something else.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
So you mentioned right at the outset, Marilyn, you spoke about credibility.
Yeah.
And we're both historians of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War, and I'm always struck by the power of the credibility imperative, as you talked about it at the beginning. So could you speculate a little bit about why it resonates so much? Why it is that administrations since 1945 up to John Kerry now speak about this, and they say, if we don't stand firm here, our adversaries will no longer fear us, our allies will no longer be able to depend on us. Couldn't one argue that being a superpower means you don't have to worry about it? Precisely that you can change your mind.
You have answered your own question.
But why,
yes. Yes, my answer is yes.
What I haven't answered is why it has the salience, the power that it has.
Because they're not as smart as you and I. You and me. As us. No, it's a really good question. Some, I think, I don't know, I don't want to psychologize it, but sometimes it's difficult not to. There's a kind of 7th grade element to it. That's what Jon Stewart, I said I'd beat you up after school, and damn it, even though I kind of like you now, I'm going to beat you up anyhow, because I said I would. This notion of credibility is what's really puzzling, is that during the Vietnam War, it was absolutely clear that America sacrificed its credibility by staying in. So that's very odd. I mean, here you are saying, we must be credible, we must be credible. And the longer the United States demonstrated that it could not prevail over this two-bit country, what does that do for allies and enemies? Well, actually, they look at the devastation and they say, yeah, thank you, not for me. But, you know, you can do it that way. We can beat you up so bad, you won't want to go to war with us? I mean, I think that the temptation to argue on the grounds of credibility it's a habit of thought that's not examined and never explained to the public at large. So the real fear is, but you know, no, let me turn the question back. If credibility in what I promise is so important, how come no president fulfills any campaign promise? I mean, promises are broken all the time. Nobody doubts the power of the presidency. No? I mean, I don't know how to explain it, except as I think what's necessary is every time the word is used, one has to protest and say, no, credibility is not involved. That is a really dumb concept, and we can get rid of it. It has gotten us into terrible trouble. It has made us look absurd to any thinking individual. We're not going to use it anymore. We know our strength. We know our interests. We'll act on our interests. My problem is that, you know, it's a question of who's our. I mean, the interests of some people in the United States are not my interests, and they will pursue them. So that's where my pathetic little appeal for mobilization and struggle and fighting back comes in. I don't see many sources of it, but I don't know how else to think about it, other than to say one protests in any way one can. And this has been an opportunity. There's this little break in the wall of war, a wall of war that's enabled because none of you will go to war unless you want to. And if you want to, you can, but otherwise you don't have to. And when I talk to audiences like you, during the Vietnam War, especially in the period when there was a lottery, every male in that audience was scared, and with good reason. Their choices were run away, resist bravely and go to prison and maybe get raped, or acquiesce and go to a war that you didn't believe in for a second. That necessity has been removed. And that has given the executive power for war immense leeway. I had thought permanent leeway, and that's why I keep coming back to what just happened. It's not permanent. People do get tired of just, these are futile wars, and people realize that, and they don't want them anymore. That seems to me an amazing shift. I say that, and then I have to back up and say, maybe. Maybe it is. I hope it is. Yeah.
So you say we're developed Iraq syndrome. Do you think that we're still susceptible the same way that the Vietnam syndrome was to a type of Gulf War situation?
Sure.
Do you think if the leadership just finds a good war that everyone will like, okay, that was great, do you think there's anything different now as opposed to back then that would make these movements survive more than back then?
I really don't know. I think that faced with an Iraq syndrome, there will be a mobilization to overcome it. Syria may have been the wrong place. There'll be another opportunity. I'm really not worried about opportunities for the use of American military power. So I think that the Iraq syndrome will be then something to be overcome. The Iraq war itself will be reinterpreted so that it can be used for current needs. I think that's very likely to happen. There's a possibility this is a real break. It's only a real break if something more happens. You know, and so far, I don't know what the outcome is going to be with the negotiations that are currently ongoing. Assad agrees to sign on to the Convention Against Chemical Weapons. What is going to be asked of him? Will he be able to do it? How do you negotiate a situation in which you've already said that you want one party to the negotiations out before you ever start negotiating. I mean, there's such hard stuff ahead. But the pause in the drive to using military power matters, and it can possibly be used. That's what I think. It's a really limited thing I'm saying. And I defer to the gentleman who doubted my optimism. It probably is right. But, you know, still, you hope. Why not? Yeah, Chandra.
Yes, Marilyn, thank you so much for this stimulating speech and also your article. I share you. And the sense, and interestingly, in all the previous wars, you find that it was without the kind of ambiguity that we are having now in describing the efforts we're going to make as the just one. You know, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam and Korea, it's communist evil. Mm-hmm. But Syria, you know, they're all bad guys.
Well, that's the other big change, is that there's really no one to support it.
No, that's an indication of larger situation we are facing.
Yeah, I think that's
Isn't Russia our enemy? Is China our enemy? What is this damn, Pacific Asia pivot? Who are we going to deal with? The suppliers of all those, cheap commodities? Our students who are able to go to Walmart to buy, they are not our enemy. And after all, also, neither Russia nor China now have overseas bases. They don't have a kind of military bloc. And so we are really facing a kind of an ambiguity, but still.
Sherman, I hate to tell you this, but China is the once and future enemy. It's going to serve for all of our lifetimes. It's always there, big. It's big.
I disagree that part. And you know why I disagree, because we have discussed it and so much.
I just think it's there to be used. There's going to be think Hillary Clinton, she'll find a way.
My point is actually, my question is it this kind of ambiguity, first time in recent history, in U.S., capacity and ability to define international enemy will that point to the really real challenge we're facing, which is.
Well, one of the things, think about the use to which human rights, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, all of that have been put and may be put again in the future. I mean, Obama appoints Samantha Power to the UN, where she now has to carry out negotiations with the Russians. It's such a punishment for her. I actually, if I didn't dislike, I would feel sorry for her. But anyhow, but she uses, and was very serious about it, humanitarian intervention, militarily expressed, is a responsibility of the United States. Okay, we pass it up this time. There's going to be something horrible will happen. And one has to really think, do you let all horrors go by? I mean, are there no times when you intervene? That's a discussion one can have. So far, we haven't been able to have it because the interventions that have occurred have been under such false flags.
Yeah. Actually, this is also the humanitarian and human rights. That's a normative. It's justified, and it also needs international, cooperation. And it's a serious situation. One thing that is interesting, because like Russia, this Putin does not argue for a normative level, say the kind of punishment, use of a chemical weapon, and he just say factual. Who did? Who has done this? Can you, so that's a very important change.
No, I think you're right. It is an important change. I think these are all things to watch. And what I mainly feel is that one has to keep reading very carefully everything and thinking about it all the way through, because this is a moment, I think, of possible change. Just possible.
Well, this is sort of an effort to find out how radical you are. Pretty radical, I think. Do you think that been no productive role for the threat power of the United States to play in containing dangerous great power, in containing dangerous regional power, dangerous tyrant. There have been bad regimes out there, or is it that if you're open to the use of American threat power in any case, it's just bound to be a license to be abused? Notice if that isn't the idea, and if sometimes uses of American threat power are positive, it might be an achievement to breaking the chemical weapons taboo. Oh, politicians decide under what pressure people can give.
Think about all of the evil regimes that you have known, and how utterly ineffective America's threat power is against them, because the United States has never chosen to in any way threaten them. So who gets to choose whom we threaten and who we don't? I mean, take Bahrain. Bahrain, you have had peaceful demonstrations and demonstrators being beaten up, over the head, jailed, tortured, you name it, and from this administration, utter silence. From Samantha Power, absolute silence. You want to talk about the great liberal democracy in Saudi Arabia? I mean, you know, there are terrible places. The United States chooses to ignore some terrible places, not others. Well, I want to have a real discussion of why this terrible place and not that terrible place. And then I want to talk about, isn't there another way to do this? Hans Blix, who is my complete hero for the role he played in the efforts to prevent the misuse of intelligence that the Bush people used to get the United States into Iraq, Blix had a very, very thoughtful piece about Syria. And he said, let's say Syria that Assad not only has, because we know he has, but that he used them. And maybe he even threatens to use them again. What should we do? Send in troops? Why? Did you ever hear about talking? Did you ever hear about negotiations? Did you ever hear of a meeting? Did you ever hear about calling all of the surrounding powers to talk about it? In which you include Iran, and you include everybody in the region that's affected. Why the military first? You know, the United States is supposed to be war as a last resort. Nonsense. War hasn't been a last resort for the United States since 41. When is war a last resort? I just simply don't see any of the intervention, and Libya is the perfect example. Libya, Obama is very proud. Samantha Power, it says in the New York Times, was very, very influential in pushing Obama into Libya. And he led from behind. This is wonderful. We're leading, but we're from behind, we're not being, okay. So you get rid of Gaddafi. What does Gaddafi do? First, he gets rid of his chemical, he hid some, it's true, he's not stupid, but he got rid of a lot of his stockpile, and he gave up the effort to get a nuclear weapon, and the next thing he knows, he's out of power. Fine, he was a terrible, terrible, terrible ruler. Fine, he's out of power. What's left in Libya? You read the papers about Libya and you just want to weep. So, great, the United States led from behind, humanitarian intervention. Benghazi was going to be God knows what. What's Benghazi now? I mean, it's Benghazi, it's the same place. So, you know, this use of military force, it just seems to me as an automatic thing. There isn't a world in which there can be a policeman made up of 3 Western powers. No, it can't. The world, that's not the world anymore. It's not a great world. It's a world full of danger. I mean, I have grandchildren, and you know, sometimes I have nightmares about the world they're going to grow up in. And I used to have this little, I don't really believe in anything, but I still now and then knock wood and little superstitious things and kind of a whispered prayer. And my prayer is that the world be safe through my grandchildren's lifetime. It's all I want. Then I don't care what. But it is, I mean, every way I look at it, I worry about them. So I would like to see the United States contribute to making it better. I do not think the exercise of military power by the United States makes the world better. I think it makes it worse. And I think the hypocrisy of talking about, I just want to say one more thing. Every time you read that figure, 1,400, no one uses that figure. The UN figure is almost 380, something like that. It's obscene to argue about numbers, but that 1,400 number is sheer propaganda. It's used over and over again. Nobody knows where the Americans came up with it. And then they say 1,400 and 400 children. There were many children who died in that gas attack, and many grown-ups. And the total number was something under 400. It makes a difference if you say 400 and you say 1,400 over and over again. That is just, that's the lie told over and over again until you believe it yourself. But that was a digression, and now I can't remember where I was going with this particular screed. I am so glad this march to war has been stopped. I want to just sit in and enjoy it for 5 minutes before I have to give it up and say, oh, well, things really are as terrible as in my heart of hearts, me and that guy knew they were. Yeah.
Is there anything to be said about the fact that someone's making lots of money on this? So
That one, sorry.
that there's corporate interest making lots of money on war. War is very lucrative, and there's no.
Well, I
say
read
take
that.
$300 million and give it to the poor. I mean, there's no money to be made. And when you sort of said whose interests are being served here and whose lobby, I mean, I'm all for organization and opposition, but I really wonder if the story is partly because it's very lucrative to have war.
It is very
There's no
lucrative.
other place now, given the ways in which industrial capital has actually moved, to find it as lucrative a source to keep accumulation going. So it's about America, but it's also about the interests that get served here.
Well, this question has been raised, and efforts have been made to answer it by economists, which is not me at all, but Robert Reich in his new movie. And also, there was a book by someone named Abramsky that was reviewed in Sunday's Times. And that one, the book, title of which I've forgotten, which deals with the current state of the economy and exactly what you're talking about, suggests ways out, ways in which you can get out from under the military-industrial complex. It's not so industrial anymore, is it? It's the military complex, and begin to think about how you can have redistributive justice. It's not, at least in this book, it doesn't sound, in the review, it doesn't sound impossible. So one thing is to have good guy economists, and there are many, and they do talk about exactly this. It's not, I mean, it's a pity that Obama appointed Larry Summers, but if you read Joe Stiglitz, if you read Krugman, there are economists who think about exactly these questions and think of ways out of it, or suggest ways out of it, in which there would still be profit, people would still be accumulating, perhaps not at the insane levels they do now. And that's the question. Did you see the thing on corporate salaries the other day in the Times? Someone earns, what, $40 million a year? A year? So there are ways you can think about that I don't think it's impossible. I think very difficult, yes. On the Syria thing, there's another element that I didn't talk about and that does have to be, I at least have to acknowledge, and that is a couple of political economists have talked about the way in which there is pipeline interests involved. So Saudi Arabia would like to have a pipeline that runs through that runs through a Syria controlled by the opposition, not by Assad. And I've forgotten the exact route, but it's a natural gas. And it draws on Qatar's natural gas field. Qatar has a natural gas field which it shares with Iran. Iran wants a pipeline that goes Iran, Iraq, Assad, Syria, and out to Europe. Saudi Arabia wants one that goes from Qatar through. How much of a role does this play? I honestly don't know. It certainly plays a role in Saudi policy, for sure. Does it play a role in American policy? I don't know. It's a question. Right, the pipeline issue has come up in Afghanistan, it comes up in Syria. It's certainly present. Is it causative? How determinative is it? I have no idea. I think it's as well to keep it in mind, because when you know there's a specific economic interest, you can also begin to speak out against it, which you can't do if it's invisible to you, which most of the time it is. Yeah.
I haven't heard you mention about Congress. Since the Vietnam War, I mean, Congress in theory is the only group that has the power to declare war. Right since the Gulf Tonkin Resolution, the president will be able to go to war wherever he wants. And the only reason that Syria was stopped by going to Congress wasn't because Congress decided it wasn't going to go to war, but the president went to Congress. I don't know why, but he did. And even while he was going there, all of the talking heads said, why is he going to Congress? He doesn't have to go to Congress. Well, doesn't that have something to do with Bush?
Sure. Well, there was, there was this moment. The War Powers Act did make a stab at controlling executive use of force abroad. You were supposed to, the executive was given 90 days, I think. I can't remember. They could do what they wanted for 90 days, but then they had to come and talk to Congress. I mean, it wasn't very strong, but it was a bit of an effort to reverse the trend that has pertained since the only time in my lifetime that Congress has actually declared war, which was 1941. So there's some efforts have been made to reverse the trend. Obama's going to Congress this time is very interesting. The fullness of why he went, I don't know. I think it had something to do with the British. I think he was worried about the use of force in Syria and wanted a resolution that would cover the case. And I think he was, as everyone was, surprised by the reaction. I mean, these Congress people went home and they couldn't, at least as I see it, they couldn't believe what they were hearing from their constituents, who all said, and not all the constituents were, peace-loving, left-leaning people. They were people who said, do not allow that socialist, illegitimate president to take us to war. So it's the voices of the people are, they're very mixed. They're very mixed. And one can worry about some of them. Will this set a precedent? And what kind of a precedent? After all, there have been congressional resolutions before. Tonkin, as you say, Gulf War I, there was a congressional resolution, which a lot of people voted against. Gulf War II, not many people voted against, but there was a congressional resolution, which really was to approve a decision already taken. Obama left this more open, which who knows if this could be precedent building? I don't know. It depends on the president and the situation. I can imagine a president who would say, gee, remember 20 years ago when Obama didn't go to war and took it to Congress? Why don't we do this? Because I don't think this is a good war despite the pressure. One can imagine it being used as a precedent in the future. It's a possibility. It's awfully nice as an idea to go to Congress. Although this Congress, who knows? I mean,